Picture this: a battlefield shrouded in dust and chaos, where the fate of kingdoms hinges not just on swords and shields, but on the sheer ingenuity of human minds. The medieval period was far more than just knights in armor and towering castles. It was an era where military brilliance reshaped the world in ways that still leave us speechless today. Think of the audacity it took to outmaneuver an enemy 10 times your size, or the sheer determination to hold a fortress against impossible odds. These weren't just battles, they were masterclasses in strategy, courage, and sometimes pure, breathtaking defiance of logic. And that's exactly what we're about to explore together: 30 of the most astonishing military feats from a time when every victory was a testament to human cunning and resilience. What makes these stories so captivating isn't just the scale of the conflicts, but the sheer creativity behind them. Imagine besieging a city by building an entire fortress to surround it, or turning the tides of war with a single, unexpected maneuver that caught even the most seasoned commanders off guard. These weren't just acts of brute force, they were strokes of genius born from desperation, ambition, and an unshakable will to survive. From the icy fields of Scandinavia to the sun-baked walls of the Holy Land, medieval warriors and tacticians pushed the limits of what was possible, leaving behind legacies that still echo through history. So why do these feats matter today? Because they remind us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, human ingenuity can triumph. Whether it's a lone general rallying his troops against impossible numbers, or a city holding out for years against a relentless siege, these stories are more than just history. They're proof of what people can achieve when pushed to their limits. And as we unravel these 30 incredible moments, you'll see how each one didn't just change the course of a battle, it changed the course of empires. So settle in, because we're about to journey back to a time where every decision could mean glory or ruin, and where the line between defeat and legend was thinner than a sword's edge. Medieval warfare was far more than clashing steel and charging cavalry. It was a grand stage where strategy, innovation, and sheer willpower decided the fate of nations. Take the siege of Constantinople in 1453, where the Ottomans didn't just rely on brute strength to breach the legendary walls. Instead, they engineered a staggering feat of logistics, dragging an entire fleet of warships overland to bypass the city's sea defenses. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a stroke of genius that reshaped the balance of power for centuries. What's truly fascinating is how these feats reveal the interplay between technology and tactics. The English longbow, for example, didn't just win battles, it revolutionized warfare itself. At Agincourt in 1415, a vastly outnumbered English force turned the tide against French knights not through numbers, but through disciplined volleys of arrows that turned the muddy battlefield into a killing ground. It wasn't just about the weapon, it was about how leaders like Henry V used terrain, timing, and psychology to humble one of Europe's mightiest armies. Yet beyond the weapons and the battles, these stories are testaments to human resilience. Consider the defenders of Malta in 1565, who held off an Ottoman siege for months despite starvation and overwhelming odds. Their refusal to surrender wasn't just about bravery, it was about understanding that sometimes the greatest weapon is sheer determination. These moments remind us that history isn't just shaped by kings and empires, but by ordinary people pushed to extraordinary limits. And that's why these feats still resonate today, because they capture the essence of what it means to face the impossible and refuse to back down. The year was 717, and Constantinople stood as the last great bastion of the Byzantine Empire, a city surrounded on all sides by the relentless forces of the Umayyad Caliphate. With a fleet of nearly 2,000 ships and an army rumored to number in the hundreds of thousands, the Muslim forces were poised to deliver what should have been a crushing blow. But what unfolded over the next year would defy all expectations. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Leo III, didn't just hold the line, they orchestrated one of the most astonishing defensive stands in military history. At the heart of their success was a weapon so fearsome, its very composition remains a mystery to this day: Greek fire. This liquid flame could burn on water, clinging to ships and men alike with terrifying persistence. As the Umayyad fleet closed in, Byzantine ships equipped with siphons unleashed hell upon the invaders, turning the sea into a blazing inferno. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical damage. Imagine being a sailor watching in horror as fire that couldn't be extinguished consumed your comrades and vessels in moments. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a masterpiece of medieval warfare that played on both fear and physics. But technology alone didn't save Constantinople. The city's legendary walls, triple-layered fortifications that had withstood sieges for centuries, proved their worth once again. Byzantine engineers had designed them to absorb and deflect assaults, while defenders rained down arrows, stones, and of course, more Greek fire from above. The Umayyads threw everything they had at those walls, yet every attack crumbled against their resilience. And then came winter, a brutal, unrelenting winter that starved and froze the besieging forces. The Byzantines, meanwhile, had stockpiled supplies and even dismantled buildings to deny the enemy resources. It was a war of attrition, and Constantinople outlasted them all. The aftermath of this siege rippled far beyond the battlefield. By repelling the Umayyads, the Byzantines didn't just preserve their empire, they altered the trajectory of Europe itself. Had Constantinople fallen, the Islamic advance into Europe might have surged unchecked. Instead, the victory bought crucial time for the fractured kingdoms of the West to regroup. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest military feats aren't about conquest, but about holding the line against overwhelming odds. And in that regard, the defenders of Constantinople didn't just win a battle, they changed the course of history. On a crisp October morning in 1066, two armies faced each other across the rolling fields of Hastings, each carrying the weight of a kingdom's future. Harold Godwinson's Anglo-Saxon forces stood atop Senlac Hill, shields locked in a near-impenetrable wall, while William of Normandy's troops prepared for an assault that would hinge not on brute force, but on deception. What unfolded that day wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare where a single tactic, the feigned retreat, would rewrite the destiny of England. The Normans didn't just charge blindly uphill, they played a calculated game. After initial clashes failed to break the Saxon shield wall, William's cavalry pretended to flee in disarray, luring pockets of Harold's men into reckless pursuit. Imagine the confusion. Anglo-Saxon soldiers, convinced victory was within grasp, abandoning their defensive stronghold only to find Norman horsemen wheeling around to cut them down. This wasn't chaos, it was a trap meticulously sprung, exploiting the heat of battle to fracture discipline. The Bayeux Tapestry captures these moments in vivid detail, from the chaos of the retreats to the deadly volleys of Norman archers that weakened the Saxon line. But Hastings was more than a tactical triumph, it was a cultural earthquake. William's victory didn't just replace one king with another. It dismantled the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, redistributing land to Norman lords and weaving French into the very fabric of English language and law. The Domesday Book, compiled just 2 decades later, stands as a testament to this transformation, a meticulous inventory of conquest's aftermath. Even the landscape changed as towering motte and bailey castles sprouted across the countryside, symbols of a new order stamped into the earth. What makes Hastings extraordinary isn't merely the scale of its consequences, but the fragility of the moment. Had Harold's forces resisted the bait, or had the weather not delayed William's invasion long enough for the Saxons to fight a bloody battle at Stamford Bridge just days prior, history might have unfolded in whispers rather than seismic shifts. Yet in the end, it was William's understanding of human nature, not just warfare, that sealed his victory. He knew when to feign weakness, when to press an advantage, and how to turn a single day's clash into a legacy that would endure for centuries. The Battle of Hastings reminds us that sometimes the greatest military feats aren't just about winning the field, but about reshaping the world that comes after. For nearly 9 decades, Jerusalem had been held by Crusader kings, a Christian stronghold in the heart of the Holy Land. But in the summer of 1187, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, achieved what many thought impossible. His recapture of Jerusalem wasn't just a military victory. It was a masterstroke of patience, planning, and psychological warfare, proving that the greatest conquests aren't always won by the sword alone. The road to Jerusalem began months earlier at the Battle of Hattin, where Saladin outmaneuvered the Crusaders with a cunning blend of terrain mastery and tactical patience. Under the scorching July sun, he lured the overconfident forces of Guy of Lusignan into a waterless wasteland, surrounding them on the slopes of an extinct volcano. By the time the Crusaders realized their predicament, it was too late. Saladin's archers rained fire upon their parched ranks, while his cavalry sealed off any escape. The capture of the True Cross, the Crusaders' most sacred relic, shattered their morale in a single blow. This wasn't just a defeat, it was the unraveling of an entire kingdom's defenses in one decisive stroke. Yet what happened next cemented Saladin's legend. When Jerusalem's gates finally opened to him that October, he could have unleashed the same brutality the Crusaders had shown decades earlier. Instead, he offered terms of surrender so generous they stunned contemporaries. Unlike the blood-soaked streets of 1099, when the First Crusade took the city, Saladin forbade mass executions. Ransom was set at a fraction of what his advisors demanded, and thousands were freed without payment. Even his fiercest foes, like Balian of Ibelin, negotiated with dignity, proof that Saladin understood the power of mercy as a strategic tool. The brilliance of this campaign lay in its long-game vision. By securing Jerusalem without unnecessary destruction, Saladin didn't just reclaim a city, he denied the West a rallying cry for immediate retaliation. His chivalry became a weapon, dividing European leaders who might have united against him. Chroniclers on both sides marveled at his restraint, with one Crusader knight grudgingly admitting, "He conquered by generosity." In the annals of medieval warfare, few triumphs resonate like Saladin's Jerusalem. It was a victory that balanced steel with statesmanship, proving that the highest military art sometimes lies not in crushing enemies, but in leaving them, and history, no choice but to remember you with respect. The fortress of Zying wasn't just strong, it was a nightmare to besiege. Perched at the confluence of the Han and Yangtze rivers, its towering double walls and flooded moats made it the linchpin of southern China's defenses. For 5 years, the Mongols under Kublai Khan threw everything they had at it, only to be repelled again and again. But what happened next wasn't just a siege, it was a revolution in medieval warfare, where brute force met cutting-edge innovation in a clash that would redefine the limits of military engineering. The game changer came from an unexpected direction: two Persian engineers named Ismail and Aladdin, who brought with them knowledge of a terrifying new weapon, the counterweight trebuchet. Unlike traditional traction trebuchets powered by teams of men pulling ropes, these behemoths used massive counterweights to hurl projectiles with terrifying precision and force. The Mongols didn't just adopt this technology, they perfected it, building siege engines capable of launching stones weighing over 300 pounds. Imagine the defenders' horror as walls that had stood for generations began crumbling under barrages from nearly a mile away. Yet the real masterstroke was how the Mongols combined these innovations with relentless psychological pressure. They constructed floating bridges to cut off Yong's river supply lines, while their engineers assembled prefabricated siege towers on site, a logistical marvel for the 13th century. When traditional assaults failed, they turned to early gunpowder weapons, filling hollowed-out projectiles with incendiary mixtures that exploded inside the city. This wasn't just a siege, it was a full-spectrum campaign that attacked defenders' morale as much as their walls. The fall of Zying in 1273 sent shockwaves across China. By proving even the strongest fortifications could be broken, Kublai Khan shattered the myth of southern invincibility, clearing the path for his Yuan dynasty to unify the country. But the legacy of this siege runs deeper than conquest. It marked a turning point where gunpowder began its ascent from novelty to battlefield dominance, foreshadowing the end of castle warfare itself. The Mongols didn't just win a city that day, they ushered in a new era where technology, not just courage, would decide who ruled the world. Rain had fallen for days, turning the fields of Agincourt into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud, a detail that would prove far deadlier than any sword. When Henry V's exhausted English army faced the French on October 25, 1415, the odds weren't just unfavorable, they were laughable. 6,000 Englishmen, most of them lightly armored longbowmen, stood against a French force 3 times their size, including hundreds of the heaviest cavalry in Christendom. Yet by day's end, the muddy ground would swallow French pride alongside their knights, as one of history's most improbable victories unfolded. The secret to Henry's success wasn't just the longbow, though its impact was devastating. Each 6-foot yew bow could loose arrows at nearly 200 feet per second, punching through armor at close range. But the real genius lay in how Henry used terrain as a weapon. He positioned his men on a narrow strip of land flanked by dense woods, forcing the French into a bottleneck where their numbers meant nothing. As the French cavalry charged, their horses floundered in the mud, arrows raining down in volleys so thick they darkened the sun, according to one chronicler. The result was chaos knights in heavy plate armor drowning in the mire, unable to rise, while English archers picked them off with ruthless efficiency. What makes Agincourt more than just a battle won by archers is the psychological warfare Henry waged. Before the fighting began, he ordered his men to sharpen wooden stakes and plant them at angles in the ground, a simple but brilliant defense against cavalry charges. When the French finally retreated, Henry refused to let his men chase them, knowing discipline was their only advantage. His decision to execute prisoners, while controversial, shattered French morale completely. This wasn't brute force, it was a masterclass in leveraging every possible advantage from weather to fear. The aftermath rippled far beyond that muddy field. Agincourt shattered the myth of invincible heavy cavalry, proving that disciplined infantry with ranged weapons could dominate the battlefield. It cemented the longbow's reputation so thoroughly that French chroniclers called it the devil's weapon. For England, the victory became a national legend, immortalized by Shakespeare and still invoked as a symbol of overcoming impossible odds. But perhaps its greatest lesson was timeless. In warfare, as in life, sometimes the most formidable enemy isn't the army across the field, it's the ground beneath your feet. By the summer of 1565, the tiny island of Malta had become the stage for one of history's most desperate stands. The Knights Hospitaller, a battle-hardened order of warrior monks, faced an Ottoman force so vast its fleet darkened the Mediterranean horizon. 40,000 invaders against 600 knights and a few thousand irregular troops, the math spelled annihilation. Yet what unfolded over 4 grueling months wasn't a swift conquest, but a masterclass in defiance, where ingenuity and sheer grit turned a hopeless situation into a legend. The knights' first stroke of brilliance lay in their preparation. Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, a 70-year-old veteran with scars from decades of war, knew Malta's fortifications inside out. He transformed the island into a labyrinth of death-collapsing tunnels to create hidden killing zones, reinforcing walls with sandbags to absorb cannon fire, and even coating the streets with grease to send charging enemies sprawling. Every inch of ground was designed to bleed the Ottomans dry. When the invaders captured Fort St. Elmo after weeks of brutal fighting, they paid for it with over 6,000 lives. The Ottomans' commander, Mustafa Pasha, reportedly muttered, "If the child cost this much, what price the parent? But fortifications alone don't win sieges, people do." The knights turned nighttime into their ally, launching daring raids that destroyed Ottoman siege engines and supply depots. One particularly audacious sortie saw a small band of defenders swim across the harbor, set fire to the enemy's artillery positions, and vanish back into the darkness. These weren't just tactical victories, they were psychological blows that chipped away at Ottoman morale. Meanwhile, Valette himself fought alongside his men, his presence a living banner of resistance. When a cannonball tore through a room where he was dining, killing 3 companions, he simply moved to another table and continued eating, a moment that became emblematic of the defenders' unshakable resolve. The turning point came in September when scorching heat and dwindling supplies finally broke the Ottoman siege lines. A relief force from Sicily arrived to find the invaders in retreat, their once proud army reduced to a shadow. Malta stood unconquered, but the victory's impact rippled far beyond its shores. This was the first major check on Ottoman expansion into Europe, a defeat so stinging it marked the beginning of the empire's slow retreat from Mediterranean dominance. For the knights, it cemented their reputation as the unbreakable shield of Christendom. What makes Malta's defense timeless isn't just the military brilliance, it's the human element. This was a story of bakers and blacksmiths fighting alongside knights, of women carrying water to douse fires under cannon barrage, of every soul on the island choosing to stand when surrender would have been easier. In an age where superpowers seemed unstoppable, Malta proved that determination, cleverness, and unity could rewrite the script of history. The knights didn't just hold a fortress that summer, they held the line between 2 worlds. For nearly 800 years, the Iberian Peninsula had been a patchwork of warring kingdoms and shifting borders, where Christian and Muslim rulers vied for dominance. By the late 15th century, only one stronghold remained: Granada, the jewel of Al-Andalus, its palaces and gardens a testament to Islamic Spain's golden age. But in 1492, after a decade-long campaign that blended brute force with shrewd diplomacy, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile brought this centuries-old struggle to a close. The fall of Granada wasn't just a military victory. It was the culmination of a cultural and religious crusade that forged a new Spanish identity and reshaped the world beyond. What made this conquest remarkable wasn't just its scale, but its meticulous execution. The Catholic monarchs didn't rush headlong into battle. Instead, they methodically isolated Granada, cutting off supply routes and leveraging rivalries among Muslim factions. Their army, a melting pot of Castilian knights, German mercenaries, and Swiss pikemen, combined medieval traditions with emerging Renaissance tactics. Massive bombards, precursors to modern artillery, pounded Granada's walls while sappers tunneled beneath its defenses. Yet even as steel and gunpowder did their work, Ferdinand and Isabella played a subtler game. They offered generous terms to Granada's emir, Boabdil, ensuring his surrender wouldn't trigger a bloodbath. The final treaty allowed Muslims to keep their faith, property, and laws, at least initially, a move as politically astute as it was merciful. The reverberations of Granada's fall extended far beyond Spain's borders. With the Reconquista complete, the Catholic monarchs turned their attention outward, funding a Genoese explorer named Christopher Columbus later that same year. The riches plundered from the New World would soon flow back to Spain, financing an empire that stretched across continents. But this moment also marked a darker turn, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims who refused conversion, a tragic coda to what had once been a relatively tolerant society. Granada's legacy is one of contradictions, a triumph of perseverance and strategy, yet also a reminder of how victory can harden into intolerance. The Alhambra's intricate arches still stand today, a silent witness to the world lost and won in 1492. In the end, the Reconquista wasn't just about reclaiming land, it was about defining what Spain would become. And in that struggle, the lessons of Granada, the power of patience, the cost of unity, and the weight of history echo through the ages. The fields of Crécy in northern France became an open-air graveyard for the age of chivalry on August 26, 1346. What should have been a straightforward French victory, with their army boasting perhaps 3 times the numbers of Edward III's weary English forces, turned into a slaughter that redefined warfare itself. The French brought pride, heavy cavalry, and generations of martial tradition. The English brought something far deadlier, thousands of 6-foot yew longbows, and a commander who understood this weapon could rewrite the rules of battle. Edward didn't just pick high ground, he engineered a killing zone. His men dug pits to trip charging horses, positioned wagons as makeshift barricades, and arranged their archers in staggered rows for relentless volleys. Then came the rain, not the gentle kind, but a summer downpour that turned the slope into a slick death trap. As the French knights lumbered uphill in their gleaming armor, the English archers loosed arrows at a rate of nearly 15 per minute per man. Contemporary accounts describe the sky darkening with shafts, each one capable of piercing plate armor at close range. The result wasn't a battle, it was target practice. But Crécy's brilliance lay beyond mere firepower. Edward grasped something his foes didn't, the psychological power of disciplined formations. While the French relied on individual heroics, his archers stood their ground, unleashing methodical destruction. When the Genoese crossbowmen hired by France advanced, their strings slack from the rain, English arrows cut them down before they could even reload. The French knights, refusing to learn, charged through their own fleeing mercenaries, only to become entangled in the chaos. By nightfall, the flower of French nobility lay heaped in piles, including the blind King John of Bohemia, whose knights tied their horses to his and rode ceremoniously to their deaths. The aftermath rippled across Europe. Crécy shattered the myth that noble birth alone made warriors invincible. Towns began training longbowmen as prized assets, and armorers scrambled to develop thicker plating. More importantly, it heralded the rise of professional standing armies over feudal levies, a shift that would eventually dissolve the medieval social order. Edward's victory proved wars could be won not by who had the most knights, but by who best combined terrain, technology, and cold-blooded efficiency. In the shadow of Crecy, the old world died not with a bang, but with the whisper of arrows finding their mark. By the winter of 1428, the city of Orleans was dying. Encircled by English fortifications, its streets echoed with hunger and despair. The 100 Years' War had reached a tipping point. If Orleans fell, France itself might crumble. Then came a teenage girl from Domremy, armed with nothing but unshakable conviction, and a sword she claimed was given by God. What happened next wasn't just a military reversal. It was the stuff of legend, where faith and audacity collided to rewrite history. Joan of Arc's arrival shattered the siege's grim calculus. The English, confident in their ring of fortified towers called bastilles, hadn't accounted for a leader who bypassed conventional tactics entirely. Joan didn't just rally troops, she transformed them. Imagine the scene: a 17-year-old peasant girl in white armor, riding at the head of a column, her banner fluttering as she promised divine favor. To the starving defenders peering over the walls, she wasn't just a commander, she was a living miracle. The French army, once paralyzed by infighting and defeatism, suddenly fought with the fervor of men who believed heaven marched beside them. The breakthrough came at the Bastille of St. Loup. Against all advice, Joan ordered a frontal assault on the strongest English position. As arrows flew, she reportedly grabbed a ladder herself to scale the walls, shouting encouragement until the Bastille fell. But her real genius lay in psychological warfare. She sent letters to the English commander, warning him to surrender or face divine wrath, a bluff so bold it sowed doubt among seasoned soldiers. When the French finally broke the siege by capturing the Tourelles fortress, it wasn't just a tactical victory, it was the moment the war's narrative flipped. The English, who had seemed invincible, now faced an enemy who fought with something more dangerous than steel, absolute certainty. Orleans' liberation rippled far beyond its walls. Joan's campaign reignited French morale, leading to Charles VII's coronation at Reims, a symbolic masterstroke that legitimized his rule. But the deeper lesson wasn't about crowns or territory, it was about the intangible power of belief. In an age where battles were often decided by who broke first, Joan proved that conviction could be the ultimate weapon. Her story endures not because she won a single siege, but because she showed the world that sometimes the most astonishing military feats begin not with strategy or strength, but with the courage to declare the impossible possible. Autumn in 732 wasn't just a season, it was a crossroads for civilizations. Near the border between modern France and Spain, Charles Martel's Frankish army stood as the last barrier between the Umayyad Caliphate's relentless expansion and the heart of Europe. The Muslim forces, fresh from conquering Iberia, had swept north like a storm, their lightning-fast cavalry raids leaving local rulers in disarray. But at Tours, they encountered something unexpected. A commander who didn't just meet their speed with brute force, but with a tactical innovation that would echo through history, the disciplined wall of heavy infantry. What made Martel's strategy revolutionary wasn't just the weapons or the warriors, but the way he leveraged terrain. He positioned his men on high ground, forcing the Umayyad cavalry to charge uphill through dense forests that disrupted their formations. The Frankish infantry, armed with axes, swords, and round shields, locked together like a single living organism. When the Umayyad horsemen crashed against this unyielding line, their momentum dissolved into chaos. Chroniclers describe the battle as a grinding, hours-long melee where discipline triumphed over mobility, a stark contrast to the swift raids that had brought the Muslims so much success. The aftermath of Tours rippled far beyond the battlefield. By halting the Umayyad advance, Martel didn't just save Francia, he preserved the fragile patchwork of Christian kingdoms that would eventually coalesce into modern Europe. Some historians argue that had the Franks faltered, the caliphate might have reached the Rhine, altering the continent's religious and cultural DNA forever. But Tours wasn't just about defense. It cemented the Franks as Europe's dominant power, paving the way for Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, to forge an empire. Yet the battle's true legacy lies in its paradox. While it's often framed as a clash of religions, the reality was more nuanced. The Umayyads weren't just conquerors, they were heirs to a sophisticated civilization that would later preserve and expand classical knowledge while Europe languished in the Dark Ages. Martel's victory ensured Christianity's survival in the West, but it also delayed the flow of that knowledge northward. Tours reminds us that history's turning points are rarely simple. They're moments where one path closes, another opens, and the full consequences unfold across centuries. The winter of 865 didn't just bring snow to England's shores. It brought an invasion force unlike anything the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had ever faced. The Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Viking warriors led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, didn't arrive to raid and retreat. They came to conquer. What followed wasn't just a series of battles, but a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, where mobility, psychological terror, and ruthless efficiency toppled kingdoms that had stood for centuries. What set this army apart was its sheer adaptability. While Anglo-Saxon rulers like Aella of Northumbria expected traditional shield wall clashes, the Vikings refused to play by their rules. They struck with terrifying speed, sailing up rivers to appear deep inland before defenses could mobilize. When they besieged York in 866, they didn't just assault the walls, they exploited political divisions, allying with local factions unhappy with Aella's rule. The city fell in a matter of days, its king executed in the brutal Blood Eagle ritual, a grim message to anyone who dared resist. This wasn't mindless violence, it was calculated theater designed to paralyze opposition before the next advance. The Danelaw, the vast territory the Vikings carved out across northern and eastern England, became their most enduring legacy. Here, Norse customs blended with Anglo-Saxon traditions, creating a hybrid culture where Viking place names still dot the landscape today. But the real brilliance lay in how they governed. Rather than obliterating local structures, they co-opted them. Saxon thegns kept their lands by swearing loyalty to Viking lords, while trade flourished under the security of Norse-controlled waterways. It was conquest with a pragmatic twist. Why destroy a system when you could profit from it? Yet the Vikings' greatest adversary would emerge from the marshes of Wessex. Alfred the Great, the only English king to earn that title, studied their tactics and adapted. By building fortified burhs and a mobile cavalry force, he countered Viking mobility with defense in depth. The struggle between these two visions, Viking fluidity versus Saxon resilience, would define England for generations. In the end, the Great Heathen Army didn't just leave behind burned monasteries and shattered kingdoms. It forced England to evolve, proving that sometimes the most lasting conquests aren't measured in territory taken, but in the changes they force upon the conquered. The narrow wooden bridge spanning the River Forth became a death trap on September 11, 1297, not because it was weak, but because William Wallace and Andrew Moray saw its potential where the English saw only a crossing point. That morning, as the sun rose over Stirling Castle, the English commander John de Warenne led his heavily armored knights and infantry across the bridge with the confidence of men who believed numbers alone guaranteed victory. What they didn't anticipate was Wallace's patience. He held his Scottish spearmen back, letting half the English force cross before unleashing his masterstroke. The terrain itself became Wallace's ally. With the river on one side and marshy ground on the other, the English cavalry, their greatest advantage, found themselves trapped in a killing zone barely wide enough for a few horses abreast. Scottish spearmen, many armed with pikes twice their height, surged forward to block retreat while others severed the bridge's supports. Chaos erupted as the English rear guard watched helplessly, their comrades on the opposite bank being cut down or drowning in the Forth's swift currents. The bridge collapse wasn't just a tactical move, it was psychological warfare, a signal that this rebellion wouldn't play by the rules of chivalry. What makes Stirling Bridge extraordinary isn't just the victory itself, but how it was achieved. Wallace and Moray leveraged every weakness in their enemy's assumptions, the English reliance on heavy cavalry in confined spaces, their dismissal of Scottish discipline, and most critically, their arrogance. Contemporary accounts describe English knights so confident they'd neglected to scout ahead, assuming the Scots would scatter at the sight of their banners. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse of their own making, yet the battle's legacy outlasted even Wallace's eventual defeat. Stirling Bridge became a blueprint for underdog victories, proving that terrain and timing could outweigh sheer numbers. It galvanized Scottish resistance, showing that a unified force, Highlanders and Lowlanders fighting side by side, could stand against one of Europe's most formidable militaries. The echoes of that day reverberated for centuries, resurfacing in rebellions from Bannockburn to Culloden. More than a military triumph, Stirling Bridge was a lesson in perception. Wallace didn't just see a bridge, he saw a funnel, a trap, a symbol. In that moment, he turned the very geography of Scotland into a weapon, and in doing so, rewrote the rules of what a smaller, determined force could achieve against an empire. By the autumn of 1529, Vienna had become the last great barrier between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Europe. Suleiman the Magnificent's army, over 100,000 strong, stood at the gates, fresh from conquering Hungary and confident this would be another swift victory. But what they encountered wasn't just a city, it was a fortress of human will. The Viennese, outnumbered nearly 20-1, transformed their streets into a labyrinth of barricades while their gunners turned the medieval walls into a killing field. This wasn't just a siege, it was a collision of civilizations where every hour bought time for a continent holding its breath. The Ottomans arrived with every advantage: sophisticated siege engines, elite janissary troops, and even specialized sappers tunneling beneath the walls. Yet Vienna's defenders, led by the grizzled mercenary Nicholas Graf Salm, turned the city's weaknesses into strengths. Narrow streets were blocked with overturned wagons, forcing attackers into deadly choke points. When Ottoman miners dug tunnels to plant explosives, the defenders countered by digging their own, listening for pickaxes, then flooding the enemy's shafts with water or smoke. Even the weather became an ally. Unseasonably cold rains turned the Ottoman camp into a quagmire, while dysentery ravaged their ranks. The Ottomans, accustomed to lightning victories, found themselves mired in a war of attrition they hadn't prepared for. What truly tipped the scales, though, was the defiance radiating from Vienna's citizens. Women and children hauled stones to repair breaches in the walls under fire. Bakers continued working through cannon barrages to feed the fighters. When a critical section of the wall was breached in late September, the defenders didn't flee. They formed a human wall of pikes and muskets, buying enough time for engineers to erect a makeshift palisade overnight. This wasn't just military strategy, it was the raw power of a population refusing to surrender. The siege's failure sent shockwaves across Europe. Suleiman's retreat marked the first major check on Ottoman expansion, proving even the mightiest empire had limits. But the deeper legacy lay in what Vienna symbolized, a line drawn in the sand where East met West, not just on maps but in the collective imagination. The city's survival didn't just preserve Habsburg rule, it bought Christendom a century and a half to regroup before the Ottomans returned. And when they did in 1683, Vienna would once again become the stage for a battle that reshaped the continent. The siege of 1529 wasn't an end. It was the opening act in a struggle that defined Europe's destiny. The summer of 1396 was supposed to mark Christendom's triumphant counterstrike against the rising Ottoman tide. Instead, the Battle of Nicopolis became a blood-soaked lesson in how pride and disunity could unravel even the most formidable alliance. Tens of thousands of crusaders, French knights, Hungarian cavalry, German mercenaries, and volunteers from across Europe marched south with dreams of glory, only to collide with a reality far harsher than their arrogance had prepared them for. What doomed this grand coalition wasn't lack of courage, but a fatal cocktail of overconfidence and cultural disdain. The French nobility, convinced Ottoman forces would crumble before their heavy cavalry, demanded the vanguard position. Ignoring warnings from Hungarian allies familiar with Ottoman tactics, they charged headlong into Sultan Bayezid's carefully laid trap. Hidden stakes maimed their horses, while disciplined ranks of Janissary archers poured volleys into the chaos. Meanwhile, Serbian cavalry allies of the Ottomans slammed into the Crusaders' flanks, turning disorder into rout. The battle wasn't lost in the clash of steel, but in the hours before, when factional rivalries and sheer hubris blinded the Crusaders to the reality before them. Nicopolis laid bare the deepening rift between medieval and emerging warfare. The Ottomans fought as a cohesive machine, with infantry, archers, and cavalry operating in synchronized layers. The Crusaders, by contrast, were a collection of individual heroes, each seeking personal glory. When the French vanguard broke formation to pursue fleeing skirmishers, they didn't realize they were being lured into a killing zone, a tactic the Ottomans had perfected against less disciplined foes. By the time the Hungarians tried to salvage the situation, it was too late. The Ottomans controlled the high ground, and their reserves were fresh. The aftermath was as brutal as the battle. Thousands of captives were executed in retaliation for Crusader atrocities earlier in the campaign, though some nobles were spared for ransom, but the true cost was strategic. Nicopolis shattered the myth of European invincibility, emboldening Ottoman expansion into the Balkans for decades. It also exposed the fragility of crusading zeal without unity or adaptability. Even the most fervent cause was doomed. Yet the battle's legacy wasn't purely destructive. For those willing to learn, Nicopolis offered a masterclass in modern warfare. Future commanders like Janos Hunyadi would study its lessons, blending heavy cavalry with flexible infantry to counter Ottoman tactics. The defeat forced Europe to reckon with a new reality. The age of feudal armies was ending, and only those who embraced discipline and coordination would survive. Nicopolis wasn't just a massacre, it was the painful birth pang of a new military era. The morning of July 15, 1410, dawned with a tension so thick it seemed to choke the very air over the fields of Grunwald. Two armies faced each other, not just soldiers, but the weight of empires. On one side stood the Teutonic Knights, a military order that had ruled the Baltic with an iron fist for centuries. Arrayed against them, a united force of Poles and Lithuanians, their banners fluttering in the humid summer breeze, represented something the Knights had never truly faced before, a coalition that refused to be divided. What unfolded that day wasn't just a battle, it was the death knell of an era where the arrogance of a single order collided with the rising might of Eastern Europe. The Teutonic Knights had long believed their disciplined heavy cavalry and fearsome reputation made them invincible. But King W. Ladislaw Jagiello of Poland and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania had spent years preparing for this moment. Their strategy was a masterclass in turning an enemy's strength into weakness. The knights, clad in gleaming white mantles emblazoned with black crosses, expected to smash through their opponents with a single, thunderous charge. Instead, they found themselves lured into a killing ground. the Lithuanian cavalry feigned retreat, drawing the overeager Teutonic horsemen into a trap where Polish reserves lay in wait. The moment the knights lost formation, the battle became a slaughter. What made Grunwald so devastating wasn't just the scale. Estimates suggest over 50,000 warriors clashed, but the completeness of the Teutonic collapse. Their Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, lay dead on the field, surrounded by the corpses of his most elite commanders. The Order's sacred banner, a relic believed to ensure victory, was torn from their grasp. For the first time in living memory, the unthinkable had happened. The Teutonic Knights, the scourge of the Baltic, had been broken, yet the battle's true significance lay beyond the bloody field. Grunwald shattered the myth of Western European military supremacy in the region, proving that Eastern powers could not only resist but dominate. The Polish-Lithuanian Union emerged as a formidable force, its influence radiating across the continent. For the Teutonic Order, the defeat was more than a setback. It was the beginning of an irreversible decline. Their grip on Prussia weakened, their prestige faded, and within decades, they would be reduced to little more than a shadow of their former might. Grunwald's legacy endures not just in history books, but in the collective memory of nations. In Poland and Lithuania, it's celebrated as a defining moment of unity and resilience. For military scholars, it's a case study in how adaptability and coalition building can topple even the most entrenched powers. And for the rest of us, it's a reminder that no empire, no matter how fearsome, is immune to the tides of change, especially when those tides are forged by the collective will of those who refuse to be conquered. The marshes and streams near Stirling Castle became the stage for one of history's most audacious uprisings in June 1314. Edward II of England marched north with an army of 15,000 knights in gleaming armor, longbowmen, and seasoned infantry confident they would crush the rebellious Scots once and for all. What they didn't count on was Robert the Bruce's genius for turning the land itself into a weapon. Bannockburn wasn't just a battle, it was a symphony of preparation, deception, and raw determination where every element from the boggy ground to the psychological warfare was orchestrated to perfection. Bruce's first masterstroke was his choice of battlefield. Instead of meeting the English on open ground where their heavy cavalry could dominate, he lured them into a cramped corridor between the Bannockburn stream and patches of treacherous marsh. The English knights, weighed down by armor, found themselves funneled into a death trap where their numbers meant nothing. Then came the schiltrons, dense formations of Scottish spearmen wielding pikes up to 18 feet long. These weren't static defenses. Bruce had drilled his men to advance in unison, their bristling wall of steel turning into a moving fortress. When the English cavalry charged, they impaled themselves on those spears, their horses panicking in the confined space. But terrain and formations alone didn't win the day. Bruce played mind games with his enemies long before the first clash. On the eve of battle, he ordered his men to dig concealed pits, pots along likely cavalry routes, camouflaged with grass and twigs. When the English advanced at dawn, their horses stumbled into these traps, breaking legs and momentum alike. Even the weather conspired against Edward's forces. A sudden summer downpour turned the already soggy ground into a quagmire, leaving the English archers struggling to plant their stakes. Meanwhile, Bruce himself fought in the thick of the fray, famously splitting an English knight's skull with his battle axe in a single blow, a moment immortalized in Scottish lore. The aftermath reverberated far beyond that bloodied field. Bannockburn shattered England's aura of invincibility, forcing Edward to recognize Scottish sovereignty in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. For Scotland, it became the defining moment of national identity, proof that unity and clever leadership could defy impossible odds. Yet the battle's true brilliance lies in its timeless lessons, how adaptability trumps brute strength, how terrain can be as deadly as any blade, and how sometimes the underdog doesn't just survive, they rewrite history. The walls of Antioch loomed like an impassable nightmare for the starving crusaders in the winter of 1097. After months of siege, what had begun as a confident campaign to reclaim the Holy Land had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The city's formidable defenses, towering stone walls reinforced by over 400 towers, seemed utterly unconquerable. Inside, the Seljuk garrison had stockpiled enough supplies to last years. Outside, the Crusaders gnawed on boiled leather and scavenged roots, their numbers dwindling from disease and desertion. Yet just when collapse seemed inevitable, fate intervened in ways no one could have predicted. What makes Antioch's story extraordinary isn't just the scale of suffering, but the chain of improbable events that turned certain defeat into victory. The breakthrough came through betrayal. An Armenian guard named Firuz, secretly resentful of his Muslim commanders, offered to unlock a tower gate under cover of darkness. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, a small band of crusaders scaled the walls near this vulnerable point, fighting their way to the main gates and throwing them open to their comrades. But their triumph was short-lived. Within days, a massive Seljuk relief army arrived, trapping the crusaders inside the very city they'd just captured. Now besiegers became besieged, crammed into Antioch streets with dwindling supplies and no escape. This is where legend intertwines with history. As morale crumbled, a Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced Christ's side beneath Antioch's cathedral. Whether divine intervention or clever propaganda, the effect was electric. Starving soldiers rallied around this relic, and when they marched out to face the Seljuk forces on June 28th, they fought with reckless fervor. Chroniclers described knights so emaciated their armor hung loose, yet charging with unnatural strength. Against all logic, they routed the larger, fresher Seljuk army in a victory that seemed to defy physics. Antioch's fall reshaped the Crusades' trajectory. Without this foothold, the march to Jerusalem would have been impossible. But the deeper lesson lies in the siege paradoxes, how desperation bred unity among fractious European factions, how a single act of treachery overturned impregnable defenses, and how the power of belief, whether in relics or survival, can alter reality itself. The Crusaders didn't just conquer a city that year, they proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, fortune favors those who refuse to surrender. By the summer of 1212, the fate of Iberia hung in the balance. The Almohad Caliphate, a formidable Muslim empire that had swept across North Africa and Spain, stood poised to crush the fractured Christian kingdoms of the north. Their army, a vast force bolstered by Berber cavalry and Andalusian infantry, camped near the Sierra Morena Mountains, confident in their superiority. What they didn't anticipate was a rare moment of unity among their Christian rivals. The Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a masterclass in how even bitter enemies could set aside their differences to face a common threat, and in doing so, change the course of history. The Christian coalition's success began not on the battlefield, but in the careful diplomacy that preceded it. King Alfonso VIII of Castile, though humiliated by previous defeats, managed to rally the often feuding kings of Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal to his cause. Even the Knights Templar and Hospitaller joined the effort, bridging divides that had seemed unbridgeable. This wasn't just an alliance, it was a shared gamble, staking their collective survival on one decisive strike. The logistical challenges alone were staggering, supplying an army of tens of thousands across the rugged terrain of central Spain required coordination that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. When the two forces finally met on July 16th, the Christians turned the Almohad's greatest strength, their numbers, into a fatal weakness. The narrow mountain passes forced the Muslim army into a cramped formation, neutralizing their cavalry's mobility. Alfonso's vanguard, led by the legendary warrior Diego López de Haro, launched a disciplined assault that shattered the Almohad front lines. But the real stroke of genius came when a local shepherd revealed a hidden mountain path, allowing Christian forces to flank the enemy camp. The sight of their fortified headquarters, complete with the caliph's red tent chained to enslaved Christian captives, being overrun, broke the Almohad morale completely. What followed wasn't just a retreat. It was a rout so total that chroniclers described the fields running red with blood for leagues. Los Novas de Tolosa's aftermath rippled far beyond that battlefield. The Almohad Caliphate, once the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, never recovered its momentum, fracturing within decades. For the Christian kingdoms, the victory proved that cooperation could yield rewards far greater than in fighting. It marked the beginning of the Reconquista's final phase, where Toledo, Cordoba, and eventually Granada would fall. But perhaps its greatest lesson was timeless. In the face of overwhelming odds, even rivals can become allies, and together they can achieve what none could accomplish alone. The battle didn't just win territory, it forged a new understanding of what Iberia could become. The summer of 1298 brought a grim reckoning for Scotland's bid for independence. Just a year after his triumph at Stirling Bridge, William Wallace found himself staring across the fields of Falkirk at an English army that had learned from its mistakes. Edward I, known as Longshanks for his imposing height, wasn't about to let terrain or arrogance defeat him twice. This time, he arrived with a force meticulously designed to dismantle Wallace's guerrilla tactics, longbowmen by the thousands, heavy cavalry held in disciplined reserve, and a ruthless understanding of how to turn Scotland's greatest strength into its fatal weakness. Wallace's schiltrons, the dense, spear-wielding formations that had devastated English cavalry at Stirling, were now trapped in the open. Edward's archers rained arrows down on the stationary Scottish ranks, their deadly volleys punching through wooden shields and thinning the defensive line. When gaps appeared, the English knights charged, not in reckless waves but in controlled strikes that exploited every vulnerability. The Scottish cavalry, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, fled early, leaving Wallace's infantry to face the onslaught alone. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a systematic dismantling of an army that had once seemed unstoppable. Yet Falkirk's true significance lay beyond the slaughter. This was a clash between two eras of warfare. Wallace represented the old ways, relying on terrain, morale, and the element of surprise. Edward embodied the future, a cold calculus of combined arms where archers softened targets for cavalry to finish. The English king's willingness to adapt was devastatingly clear. He'd studied Wallace's tactics and engineered a countermeasure that left no room for heroics. The aftermath was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Edward didn't just defeat Wallace, he dismantled his legend. By stripping Scotland of its belief in invincibility, he ensured that even in retreat, the rebellion lost its momentum. Falkirk became a brutal lesson. In medieval warfare, innovation wasn't optional. Those who clung to tradition, no matter how courageously, would find themselves buried by it. Wallace's legacy would endure in ballads and rebellion, but on that bloody field, Edward wrote a different story, one where technology and adaptability were the true kings of battle. The sun blazed over the fields of Legnano on May 29, 1176, as Frederick Barbarossa's imperial knights, the terror of Europe, charged toward what should have been an easy victory. The Holy Roman Emperor had spent years crushing rebellious Italian cities, his armored cavalry trampling resistance with brutal efficiency. But this time, something extraordinary happened. The Lombard League, a coalition of northern Italian city-states, didn't scatter before the thunder of hooves. Instead, their infantry stood firm, a living wall of pikes and determination that would rewrite the rules of medieval warfare. What made Legnano revolutionary wasn't just the outcome, but how it was achieved. The Lombards had learned from painful defeats. Rather than meeting the knights in open combat, they anchored their defense around the Carroccio, a massive ox-drawn wagon bearing their city banners, serving as both rallying point and fortress. Around it, they arrayed their spearmen in tight formations, their flanks protected by crossbowmen whose bolts could punch through armor at close range. When Barbarossa's cavalry crashed into these ranks, their momentum dissolved into chaos. Horses impaled themselves on pikes, while dismounted knights floundered in the mud, helpless against the Lombards' relentless advance. The battle's climax came when Barbarossa himself was unhorsed. His imperial standard captured a humiliation so profound it sparked rumors of his death. Though he eventually regrouped, the message was clear: the era of knights dominating through sheer force was ending. Legnano proved that disciplined infantry, fighting for their homes rather than feudal obligation, could outmatch even the most fearsome cavalry. Beyond the battlefield, Legnano's legacy rippled across Italy's political landscape. The Lombard League's victory forced Barbarossa to recognize their autonomy in the Peace of Venice, a turning point in the struggle between empire and city-states. It also heralded the rise of communal armies, ordinary citizens bearing arms for their shared liberty, a concept that would echo through the Renaissance. Today, Legnano's Carroccio still appears in Italian parades, a symbol of how unity and ingenuity can topple even the mightiest oppressors. This wasn't just a battle won. It was the moment medieval Europe learned that the strength of a community, when harnessed with strategy, could defy an empire. The island city of Tyre stood as a puzzle no invader had solved in centuries until the Crusaders arrived in 1124. Perched on a peninsula with walls rising straight from the sea, its natural defenses had repelled even Alexander the Great for 7 grueling months. But the Crusaders faced more than geography. Tyre's Fatimid defenders had stockpiled years of supplies, confident they could outlast any siege. What unfolded over 5 months wasn't just a military campaign. It was a chess match where every move hinged on controlling the waves as much as the land. The Crusaders' first breakthrough came from an unlikely alliance. Venetian sailors, fresh from sacking Byzantine islands, lent their fleet to blockade Tyre's harbor. This wasn't just about ships, it was about technology. The Venetians brought siege engines capable of hurling stones heavier than anything the defenders had seen, mounted directly on their vessels. Picture the scene: towering wooden contraptions rocking on the waves, launching projectiles that cracked Tyre's sea walls like eggshells. Meanwhile, Crusader engineers on land built a causeway of rubble and sand, inching forward under cover of arrow fire to bridge the gap between shore and city. Yet the real genius lay in their patience. Unlike Alexander, who stormed Tyre in a frenzy, the Crusaders played the long game. They intercepted Fatimid relief convoys, turning the sea from Tyre's lifeline into its prison. Inside the walls, supplies dwindled as morale fractured. The defenders, expecting a quick assault, found themselves trapped in a war of attrition where hunger became the Crusaders' silent ally. By July, the once proud city negotiated surrender, not because its walls had fully fallen, but because its people had lost the will to fight. Tyre's capture rippled across the Levant. It gave the Crusaders their last major coastal stronghold, linking Antioch to Jerusalem in a chain of secure ports. But beyond strategy, the siege proved something profound. In medieval warfare, mastery of both land and sea could make the impossible achievable. The Crusaders didn't just take a city that day, they wrote a blueprint for how to conquer the unconquerable through ingenuity, alliances, and the quiet, relentless pressure of time. By the sweltering afternoon of July 27, 1214, the fields near Bouvines had become a pressure cooker of clashing ambitions. Philip II of France faced not just an army, but a sprawling coalition. Otto IV's Holy Roman Empire, Count Ferrand of Flanders, and King John of England's proxies, all determined to fracture French power. What unfolded wasn't merely a battle. It was a high-stakes gambit where feudal loyalty and tactical ingenuity collided to redefine an entire continent's balance of power. Philip's genius lay in turning his enemies' greatest strength, their numbers, into their fatal flaw. The coalition forces, though formidable, were a patchwork of competing interests and languages, their coordination brittle under pressure. The French king, by contrast, had spent years cultivating a core of fiercely loyal knights and urban militias. When the fighting began near a narrow bridge over the river Mark, Philip's forces moved with a cohesion that left their adversaries struggling to adapt. His cavalry, rather than charging wildly, executed disciplined flanking maneuvers, while his infantry held firm against Otto's elite Brunswick troops. The chaos of medieval combat often favored the side that could best maintain order, and at Bouvines, the French demonstrated masterful control. But the true brilliance of Philip's victory extended beyond the battlefield. By capturing Count Ferrand and humiliating Otto, whose imperial banner was seized in the melee, he didn't just win a battle, he dismantled the political foundations of his enemy's alliance. Otto's defeat cost him the German throne, ushering in the rise of Frederick II. King John, already weakened by his struggles with English barons, saw his continental ambitions evaporate overnight. Meanwhile, Philip's triumph galvanized French national identity, transforming him from a feudal overlord into a symbol of centralized royal authority. The legacy of Bouvines lingers in the quiet shifts it triggered. It marked the twilight of the Holy Roman Empire's dominance over France and accelerated the decline of purely feudal armies in favor of royal standing forces. For the French people, chroniclers noted, the victory sparked celebrations so widespread they resembled a national holiday, a rare moment when the abstract idea of France began to eclipse the patchwork of duchies and counties that had long defined it. In the end, Bouvines wasn't just about who ruled which patch of land. It was about proving that unity and leadership could rewrite the rules of an era. The narrow mountain pass above Lake Egerie was silent on the morning of November 15, 1315, until the Swiss peasants let loose their trap. Duke Leopold I of Austria had marched his Habsburg army into the Alpine valleys with disdain, confident his heavily armored knights would crush the rebellious Swiss Confederacy like so many other peasant uprisings. What he didn't anticipate was the brutal efficiency of men fighting for their homes. As his cavalry column squeezed between the steep slopes and the lake's edge, the Swiss sprang their ambush with terrifying precision. Trees felled across the path blocked retreat, while boulders and logs rained down from above. Then came the halberds, those brutal polearms with axe blades and hooks wielded by farmers who turned the confined space into a slaughterhouse. Within hours, Leopold's elite knights lay dead in heaps, their armor no match for the sheer force of Swiss desperation. Morgarten wasn't just a battle won, it was a blueprint rewritten. The Swiss had no knights, no archers, no siege engines, just an intimate knowledge of terrain and a willingness to fight dirty. They turned the Habsburgs' greatest strength, their cavalry, into a liability by forcing them into a space where numbers and mobility meant nothing. The halberd, a tool adapted from farming implements, proved devastating against mounted opponents, hooking riders from their saddles to be finished off on the ground. This was medieval asymmetrical warfare at its most effective, where ingenuity and local advantage trumped traditional notions of martial superiority. The battle's aftermath rippled far beyond the Alps. Morgarten shattered the myth of knightly invincibility, proving that disciplined infantry with the right tools and terrain could overcome feudal elites. It marked the birth of Swiss military reputation, a tradition of fierce independence and tactical innovation that would eventually produce the legendary pikemen of later centuries. But perhaps its greatest legacy was psychological. For the first time, ordinary men had not just resisted but humiliated one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The Swiss Confederacy, once dismissed as a rabble, became a symbol that small communities could defy empires and win. What makes Morgarten timeless isn't the bloodshed, but the lesson it etched into history, that in warfare, as in life, the underdog doesn't need to play by the established rules to rewrite them. The pass where Leopold's arrogance met Swiss grit still winds through the mountains today, a silent witness to the day peasants proved that courage and cunning could topple even the mightiest oppressors. The siege of Acre was less a battle than a 2-year crucible of suffering, where the Third Crusade's greatest leaders, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, met in a brutal test of wills. By the summer of 1189, the city had become the epicenter of a struggle that would decide the fate of the Holy Land. Its towering double walls and bustling harbor made it the jewel of the Levantine coast, a prize so valuable both sides were willing to bleed themselves dry for it. What followed wasn't just a clash of armies, but a grinding war of attrition where starvation, disease, and psychological torment became weapons as deadly as any sword. Richard's arrival in 1191 transformed the siege from a stalemate into a spectacle of medieval engineering. The English king didn't just rely on brute force. He orchestrated a symphony of siege towers, trebuchets, and tunneling operations that kept Acre's defenders in constant terror. One particularly terrifying innovation was Bad Neighbor, a massive trebuchet capable of hurling stones that shattered entire sections of the walls. Meanwhile, Saladin's forces encircled the Crusaders' own camp, creating a deadly paradox. The besiegers were themselves besieged, caught between Acre's defiant garrison and the relentless strikes of Muslim cavalry. The air reeked of rotting corpses piled so high they poisoned the water supply, while dysentery and scurvy ravaged both sides. This was warfare stripped to its grim essence, a contest not just of strength but of who could endure the unbearable longest. Yet the real turning point came from the sea. Acre's lifeline was its port, and Richard's control of the waves proved decisive. When his fleet broke through the Muslim blockade, it delivered not just supplies but something far more precious: reinforcements. Fresh troops from Europe tipped the scales, allowing the Crusaders to storm breaches in the walls with renewed fury. Even then, the city didn't fall quickly. The final assault was a house-by-house slaughter, with defenders fighting from rooftops and cellars until the last possible moment. When Acre finally surrendered in July 1191, the toll was staggering: nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners executed in a single day, a chilling reminder of the war's merciless calculus. Acre's fall reshaped the Crusades' trajectory, giving Christendom a vital foothold to launch further campaigns. But its deeper legacy lies in the lessons it taught about the nature of medieval warfare. This was a battle won not by heroics alone, but by logistics, naval supremacy, and the grim arithmetic of endurance. Richard and Saladin both emerged from the siege with their reputations intact, one as a master of siegecraft, the other as a tenacious defender of Islam. Yet perhaps the most enduring truth of Acre is this: in war, even the mightiest leaders are at the mercy of supply lines, disease, and the relentless passage of time. The city's rubble held a mirror to warfare itself, a reminder that victory often goes not to the strongest, but to those who can outlast the unimaginable. The fields near Poitiers should have been a stage for French triumph. King John II marched south in 1356 with an army nearly twice the size of the English forces, his knights gleaming in the late summer sun. But what unfolded on September 19th became one of history's most lopsided upsets, a battle where discipline and terrain proved deadlier than numbers or armor. Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, didn't just defeat the French that day. He captured their king, turning a military victory into a political earthquake that would rattle Europe for decades. The English position was a masterclass in defensive ingenuity. Rather than meeting the French head-on, the Black Prince arrayed his forces along a ridge flanked by thick hedges and marshland, funneling the enemy into narrow killing zones. His longbowmen, positioned on the flanks, unleashed volleys so dense they darkened the sky, their arrows punching through armor at close range. But the real stroke of brilliance came in the timing. When the French cavalry charged uphill through the mud, exhausted and disorganized, the English knights dismounted for better control counterattacked with brutal precision. This wasn't the chivalric combat of tournament fields. It was a systematic dismantling of an army that had underestimated its foe at every turn. King John's capture was the crowning humiliation. Surrounded and wounded, he fought on until his sword shattered, then surrendered to a knight who reportedly didn't even recognize him at first. The image of France's monarch led away as a prisoner became an emblem of the 100 Years' War's shifting tides. For England, the victory was more than tactical, it was propaganda gold, proof that their hybrid army of longbows and dismounted knights could outthink and outfight the continent's premier military power. Yet Poitiers' true legacy lay in its aftermath. The ransom demanded for John's release, equivalent to twice France's annual revenue, crippled the kingdom's finances, sparking peasant revolts and political chaos. Meanwhile, the English solidified their reputation as masters of adaptive warfare, where terrain and psychology were as vital as steel. The battle didn't just showcase the longbow's dominance, it revealed a fundamental truth of medieval combat, that the best commanders didn't just fight their enemies, they outmaneuvered their expectations. Poitiers wasn't merely a defeat for France. It was a lesson in how arrogance and tradition could become the heaviest shackles on the battlefield. The fields of Kosovo on June 28, 1389, were soaked in more than just summer rain. They bore the weight of two empires' futures. That morning, Prince Lazar of Serbia faced Sultan Murad I's Ottoman forces, not just as a military opponent, but as the last bulwark of Balkan resistance against an expanding Islamic power. What unfolded wasn't merely a battle. It became the stuff of epic poetry, where fact and legend blurred into a national mythos that still echoes through Serbian identity today. At first glance, the clash seemed straightforward. Serbian knights renowned for their heavy cavalry against the Ottomans' disciplined ranks of Sipahi horsemen and Janissary infantry. But Kosovo's true drama lay in its staggering personal stakes. In a twist fit for tragedy, both leaders met their end on that field. Murad fell to a Serbian noble's daring assassination attempt, while Lazar was captured and executed after the fighting. The battle itself ended in a gruesome stalemate, with casualties so heavy that neither side could claim true victory. Yet in the centuries that followed, this mutual destruction transformed into something far more potent for the Serbs, a symbol of sacred sacrifice. What makes Kosovo extraordinary isn't its military outcome, but how it crystallized in collective memory. Serbian folklore elevated Lazar's death to a Christ-like martyrdom, framing his choice to die with honor rather than live in shame as a spiritual covenant. The Kosovo cycle, a body of epic poems turned individual acts of bravery into allegories of national virtue. Even the battlefield's blackbirds, said to have feasted on the fallen, became mythical messengers between heaven and earth. This wasn't history as cold fact. It was history as soul, woven into songs, liturgies, and the very fabric of Serbian resistance to Ottoman rule. Yet Kosovo's legacy is one of painful paradox. While it marked the beginning of Ottoman dominance in the Balkans, it also forged a Serbian identity so resilient that 6 centuries later, Slobodan Milošević would invoke Lazar's name to rally ethnic nationalism. The battle's mythology became a double-edged sword, a source of unity and a spark for later conflicts. Modern visitors to the Gazimstan monument, erected where the battle supposedly raged, tread on ground that's both cemetery and cradle, where defeat and defiance became inseparable. Kosovo reminds us that some battles matter less for who won, and more for what they come to mean. The stories we tell can outlast empires, turning even a field of loss into fertile soil for a nation's enduring spirit. By the spring of 1450, the fields of Normandy had seen generations of bloodshed in the endless tug of war between England and France. But at Formigny, something unprecedented unfolded, a battle where smoke and thunder eclipsed the familiar clang of swords. The French, long overshadowed by English longbowmen, unveiled their secret weapon, cannons positioned with lethal precision along the Canton River. This wasn't just another skirmish in the 100 Years' War. It was the moment gunpowder announced its irreversible dominance on the battlefield. What made Formigny revolutionary wasn't the mere presence of cannons. They'd been used before, but how the French integrated them into their strategy. As the English advanced under Sir Thomas Cyril, they found themselves funneled into a killing zone where artillery fire raked their flanks. Each shot tore through tightly packed ranks, turning disciplined formations into chaos. The French didn't just rely on brute force. They timed their cannon volleys to coincide with cavalry charges, creating a pincer effect that left the English no room to regroup. For the first time in decades, the longbow's lethal reach was outmatched by something far more terrifying: the ability to kill from distances no arrow could hope to touch. The aftermath was as decisive as it was symbolic. English losses numbered in the thousands, their once invincible army reduced to a scattered remnant. Within months, Normandy, held by England for over 30 years, fell back into French hands. But beyond territory, Formigny marked a paradigm shift. The battle proved that gunpowder wasn't just a novelty, it was the future. Armies that clung to traditional weapons, no matter how effective in previous eras, would soon find themselves relics. Yet the real lesson of Formigny lies in its quiet irony. The French victory wasn't just about technology, it was about adaptation. They'd studied their failures, embraced innovation, and turned the very tools their enemies dismissed into instruments of triumph. In that sense, the roar of cannons at Formigny wasn't just the sound of a battle won. It was the death knell of medieval warfare as the world knew it, and the birth of a new, more terrifying age. The autumn of 1444 brought a chilling moment of reckoning to the plains near Varna, where the last great Crusader army of the Middle Ages faced the ascendant Ottoman war machine. What began as a bold Christian counteroffensive spearheaded by King W. Ladislaw of Poland and Hungary, and the papal legate Cardinal Cesarini, quickly unraveled into a catastrophe that would seal the fate of the Balkans for centuries. The Crusaders had marched with dreams of driving the Ottomans from Europe, but their campaign was plagued by fatal divisions from the start. While the Hungarian and Polish forces favored swift action, their Wallachian allies hesitated, and Venetian naval support failed to materialize as promised. This wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a collision of fractured ambitions against the iron discipline of Sultan Murad II's forces. Murad's tactical brilliance lay in his ability to turn the Crusaders' strengths into vulnerabilities. When the Christian heavy cavalry launched their signature thunderous charge, it initially shattered the Ottoman front lines exactly as planned, but Murad had anticipated this. His Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, held their ground with terrifying discipline, while Sipahi cavalry circled to envelop the Crusaders from the flanks. The terrain itself became a trap. The retreating Ottomans lured Ladislaw's knights into marshy ground where their momentum stalled, leaving them exposed to volleys of arrows and gunfire from Ottoman arquebusiers. This marked one of the earliest battlefield uses of gunpowder weapons in Europe, a grim foreshadowing of warfare's future. The battle's climax was as dramatic as it was tragic. In a desperate gambit, Ladislaw led a direct assault on Murad's command post, only to be cut down by the Sultan's bodyguards. His severed head, mounted on a pike, became a macabre rallying point for the Ottomans and a symbol of shattered Crusader hopes. The death toll was staggering. Nearly half the Christian army lay dead, including Cardinal Cesarini and much of Eastern Europe's nobility. The Ottomans, by contrast, suffered minimal losses, a testament to their superior coordination and leadership. Varna's aftermath extended far beyond the battlefield. With the Crusader threat neutralized, the Ottomans secured their grip on the Balkans, paving the way for Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople just 9 years later. For Christendom, the defeat exposed the perils of fragmented command and half-hearted alliances. The crusade had been undermined by Venetian mercantile interests, Wallachian ambivalence, and the unrealistic optimism of leaders who underestimated Ottoman resilience. What makes Varna haunting isn't just the scale of the defeat, but its what-if quality. Had the Crusaders coordinated better or waited for reinforcements, they might have altered the course of European history. Instead, the battle became a cautionary tale about the cost of hubris and a stark reminder that in warfare, unity isn't just an ideal, it's a matter of survival. The fields of Varna didn't just bury a king and his army, they buried the last best chance to stop the Ottoman tide before it reached the gates of Vienna. The island of Rhodes in 1480 was more than just a strategic stronghold. It was the last Christian bulwark in the eastern Mediterranean, a thorn in the side of the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. When Sultan Mehmed II, fresh from his earth-shaking conquest of Constantinople, turned his gaze toward this tiny outpost, the outcome seemed inevitable. His forces outnumbered the Knights Hospitaller nearly 10-1, and his arsenal included the latest in siege technology. But what unfolded over 3 brutal months wasn't a swift Ottoman victory. It was a masterclass in how ingenuity, preparation, and sheer grit could defy even the most overwhelming odds. The Knights, led by Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson, had spent decades transforming Rhodes into a fortress ahead of its time. Their walls weren't just thick, they were smart. Designed with angled bastions to deflect cannon fire and layered defenses to compartmentalize breaches, the city's fortifications anticipated every Ottoman tactic. Underground tunnels allowed defenders to move unseen, while hidden sally ports enabled lightning-fast counterattacks. This wasn't medieval warfare as usual. It was Renaissance military engineering at its finest, a preview of the star-shaped fortresses that would dominate European battlefields for centuries. When the Ottoman assault began in May, Mehmed's forces employed everything in their playbook: relentless cannon barrages, tunneling operations to undermine the walls, and waves of Janissaries scaling ladders under cover of darkness. But the Knights had rehearsed for this moment. Their gunners targeted Ottoman artillery crews with pinpoint accuracy, while cauldrons of boiling oil and quicklime rained down on anyone who reached the ramparts. At one critical point, Dobberson himself led a desperate sortie to collapse an enemy mine, emerging from the dust with his armor dented and banners still flying, a moment so heroic it became legend. The turning point came in late July when a surprise attack on a supposedly weak sector of the walls turned into an Ottoman bloodbath. The knights had deliberately left one bastion appearing vulnerable, luring the enemy into a killing zone where crossfire from hidden positions decimated their ranks. By August, with disease ravaging his camp and morale crumbling, Maimed ordered a retreat. Rhodes had held against all logic, but the siege's true legacy wasn't just in the stones left standing. It proved that even in an age of gunpowder and empires, a small, disciplined force with superior leadership could alter history's momentum. The Knights' victory delayed Ottoman expansion into the Mediterranean for decades, buying critical time for Europe to regroup. More profoundly, Rhodes became a symbol, a flickering torch of defiance that showed the world even the mightiest tides could be turned back, if only someone dared to build walls strong enough and stand tall enough behind them. The forests of Tannenberg echoed with the clatter of armor and the thunder of hooves on July 15, 1410, a day that would forever shatter the Teutonic Order's aura of invincibility. This wasn't just a battle, it was the climax of decades of tension between the German knights and the rising Polish-Lithuanian Union, a clash where cunning, diversity, and sheer scale collided to rewrite the map of Eastern Europe. Under the scorching summer sun, the Teutonic Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen arrayed his forces with the confidence of a man who'd never known defeat, his ranks filled with the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom. What he couldn't see was how meticulously his enemies, King W., Ladislaw Jagiello of Poland, and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania, had turned the open fields into a stage for their own brutal symphony of war. The coalition's strategy was a masterclass in leveraging diversity. Unlike the Teutonic Knights' homogeneous force, the Polish-Lithuanian army was a tapestry of cultures and tactics. Lithuanian light cavalry, swift as the wind, clashed with the Order's disciplined heavy horsemen, while Polish knights held the center with a resilience born of generations defending their homeland. But the real stroke of genius came from the battlefield itself. Jagiello delayed engagement for hours, forcing the Teutonic forces to bake in their armor under the midday sun. When the knights finally charged, exhaustion and heat had already dulled their edge, and then came the feigned retreat. Vytautas's Lithuanian wing appeared to crumble, luring the overeager Teutonic knights into a deadly pursuit that shattered their formation. It was a trap as old as warfare itself, executed with flawless precision. What unfolded next was carnage on an unprecedented scale. The Teutonic knights, their ranks in disarray, found themselves surrounded by Polish reserves and hacked apart by Tartar horse archers raining arrows from the flanks. Von Jungingen, realizing the tide had turned, led a desperate last charge, only to be cut down alongside his elite commanders. By nightfall, the Order's sacred banners lay trampled in the mud, and the once mighty knights were reduced to a broken remnant fleeing for their lives. The coalition's victory wasn't just military, it was psychological. For the first time, Eastern Europe had proven it could not only resist but annihilate the forces of Western crusading imperialism. The aftermath of Tannenberg reverberated far beyond the battlefield. The Teutonic Order never fully recovered its former dominance, its territories gradually whittled away by Polish and Lithuanian expansion. The battle became a cornerstone of Polish and Lithuanian national identity, a symbol of unity against foreign oppression. Even today, the site draws visitors who stand awed by the sheer magnitude of what was achieved. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Tannenberg lies in its demonstration of coalition warfare, proof that when disparate forces unite under a shared purpose, even the mightiest adversaries can be brought to their knees. The fields of Grunwald didn't just witness a battle, they birthed a legend, one where strategy, patience, and the will to resist carved victory from the jaws of what should have been certain defeat. These astonishing medieval military feats weren't just fleeting moments of violence, they were seismic shifts that carved new borders, forged identities, and rewrote the rules of warfare itself. Take the longbow's dominance at Crecy and Agincourt, a revolution that didn't just win battles but dismantled the feudal order, proving peasant archers could topple armored nobility. Or consider Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem, where restraint and chivalry became weapons as potent as swords, setting a standard for military conduct that still resonates today. Every siege, every charge, every desperate stand was a laboratory of human ingenuity, testing the limits of what was possible with the tools of the age. The technological leaps born from these conflicts ripple into modernity. The counterweight trebuchets at Zying Yong didn't merely breach walls, they heralded the age of artillery, paving the way for gunpowder's eventual dominance. The Hussites' war wagons in the 15th century, mobile fortresses bristling with early handguns, foreshadowed combined arms tactics centuries before their time. Even failures like the Crusaders' disastrous march at Hattin became cautionary blueprints, teaching later generations the fatal cost of ignoring supply lines and local terrain. Innovation wasn't confined to weapons. It thrived in logistics, medicine, and communication, as armies evolved from disorganized war bands into disciplined forces with standardized pay and supply chains. Yet beyond tactics and technology, these feats sculpted the cultural and political landscapes we inherit today. The fall of Granada didn't just end Muslim rule in Iberia, it bankrolled Columbus' voyage, altering global history. The Swiss victory at Morgarten birthed a tradition of armed neutrality that defines Switzerland to this day. And who could measure the impact of Constantinople's walls holding against the Umayyads, preserving Byzantine culture long enough to seed the Italian Renaissance? These battles weren't isolated events, they were hinges upon which civilizations turned, their outcomes determining which languages, religions, and laws would dominate entire regions. Perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in the human element. Joan of Arc's triumph at Orleans reminds us how conviction can galvanize nations, while the doomed stand of the Knights Hospitaller at Rhodes showcases the power of preparation and adaptability. From the Mongols' ruthless efficiency to the Viking great army's shrewd assimilation, these stories reveal timeless truths about leadership, morale, and the indomitable will to survive. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions. When does innovation become oppression? How thin is the line between heroism and fanaticism? And what does it truly mean to win a war when the costs are measured in generations, not just casualties? The legacy of these feats lives on in unexpected ways, not just in history books, but in boardrooms and political strategies. Modern generals still study the Black Prince's maneuvers at Poitiers, while tech entrepreneurs emulate the rapid prototyping scene in medieval siege engineering. The past isn't dead, it's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with power, identity, and the endless quest to outthink the impossible. These 30 moments remind us that while the weapons change, the essentials of courage, creativity, and consequence remain as relevant now as they were under the banners of knights and kings. The medieval period was a theater of unimaginable bravery, cunning, and sheer audacity, where the impossible became reality through human will. These 30 military feats are more than just stories. They're masterclasses in problem-solving under pressure, proving that victory often belongs to those who refuse to accept the limits of their era. Think of the defenders of Malta, turning their island into a death trap with grease-slicked streets and hidden tunnels, or the Swiss peasants at Morgarten, transforming farming tools into weapons that toppled knights. These weren't just battles, they were revolutions in disguise, shattering expectations and rewriting the rules of what was possible. What makes these feats timeless isn't just their scale, but their lessons. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem teaches us that mercy can be as strategic as any siege engine, while the Mongols at Zying showed how embracing foreign technology, like the counterweight trebuchet, could turn the tide of empires. Even failures like the Crusaders at Nicopolis reveal a brutal truth. Arrogance is the quickest path to defeat. The past whispers to us through these moments, reminding us that adaptability, not just strength, defines greatness. A castle's walls might crumble, but the ideas born in its shadow can echo for centuries. So why do these stories still grip us? Because they're not just about kings and conquests, they're about ordinary people pushed to extraordinary limits. The bakers of Vienna keeping ovens burning during cannon barrages, the English longbowmen who leveled the feudal order one arrow at a time, the unnamed engineers who turned Greek fire into a psychological weapon. History isn't made by faceless forces, it's shaped by individuals who dared to think differently. And that's the real takeaway. Innovation isn't born in comfort. It flourishes in the crucible of necessity where survival demands creativity. As we close this chapter, consider how these medieval struggles mirror our own challenges today. The same principles that guided Henry V at Agincourt, leveraging terrain, understanding morale, exploiting weaknesses, are studied by modern leaders in boardrooms and battlefields alike. The past isn't a relic, it's a mirror. And if these feats teach us anything, it's that the human capacity to adapt, endure, and overcome is boundless. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, the next time you face an impossible odds, you're standing on the shoulders of those who refuse to back down. The medieval world may be gone, but its lessons, they're immortal. If this journey through history sparked your curiosity, let us know in the comments which feat left you awestruck. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Until next time, keep turning the pages of history. You never know what brilliance you'll uncover.